light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I guess I don't often go into much detail about it, and I don't mean to this time either, but I was in a relationship for 9 years with another man, and in reflecting on that, it kind of offers a metaphor for everyone else as well. When he and I, after seeing each other for a long time and then finally deciding whether we wanted to engage in a new form of relationship that neither he nor I had ever had before. And he was very well-to-do, but didn't have a lot of self-discipline. And so in some ways, I was really the grown-up or the mature one in the relationship. But I was living in a small apartment at the time because in spite of my well-developed work ethic, I did not have the industrial skills necessary to command a relatively high income, whereas he did. But he wasn't. But half the time they had him traveling all over the western half of the United States, so that he wasn't around much to get any of the work done. So I was, in a very traditional sense, actually, I was the homemaker, staying at home, working much harder than he did, doing 4 times as much as he did, and we both knew that. But he was the one who could go to work and demand salaries way beyond anything I could ever demand. When we finally decided, so he was the breadwinner, I was the homemaker, and it was very complimentary, but it was very traditional, actually. And we both agreed that I worked twice as hard as he did, or more. The point I'm coming to, though, is that when we finally decided to engage on a new form of relationship, to invent it and see how it went and so forth, I looked around in his condominium at the time, and I said, I can't move in with you. And he said, why? Why not? And I said, because there isn't a single empty closet in the place. It was a 2-bedroom condo with about 3-4 huge closets, and none of them was empty. They're all stuffed as tight as can be, because he came from a family of people who were very inclined toward hoarding. And so he had stuffed every single nook and cranny with something. And so there literally was no place for me to be. And so the first act of our collaboration, or our entering or transitioning into relationship, was for me to remodel one of his closets and double the clothes bars above and below each other so that we could empty closets. So I would have one closet of the 4 that were in there to put my stuff in. And I didn't really have that much anyway. I could move basically everything I owned in the back of a pickup truck at that point. That's not the case anymore, because a lot has happened since that time. But the point that metaphor brings home is that I've met a lot of gay men over the years, and not only gay men, but especially gay men, who would like to have a sense of family, who would like to have a life partner, a partner in life with whom to spend their days and make memories and build their lives around each other and so forth. A curious side note on that is that far too many of them want a relationship that costs them nothing. And someone who is, a friend and I, another gay friend and I, tried to decide once the characteristics of an ideal relationship. And it was something like no emotional baggage, no furniture, no clothes to store in a closet, no thoroughly adequate income. We went through all these different things and finally concluded, the only ideal partner, and according to that definition, is a blow-up doll. But that's another discussion we don't need to get into. But the point being, and the reason I mentioned about this form of relationship, is that when we want something new in our lives, we have to make room for it. If there's no place to put it, then we have to look in the mirror and decide whether we really want something in our lives. If there's no empty closet, if there's no place to put a desk, if there's no, somebody asked me once about getting into a relationship, and I said, well, really, the ideal is that you both sell your houses and buy one house together so that it is our house instead of somebody moving in and having to forever refer to it from that point on as his house or your house or whoever's house, but instead that'll be our house, we share it equally. And in that sense, if you're going to do a traditional relationship like I did, having this clear understanding that it's about both people contributing, one contributing money, one contributing work, but that there is an egalitarian equalness, mutuality to the relationship. And I think he and I managed that fairly well, but what we had a very difficult time managing was others' perceptions of us. But that's a whole nother discussion of the way people were looking at us and judging me and judging him and interpreting a situation as something other than what it actually was. But to me, a relationship still comes down to both people giving 100% and finding a way to weave their lives together. But the ideal is having something that is ours, not something that is his or hers, whichever way it goes. But that this is ours, and because it is ours, there is a mutuality and a sharing and a jointness to it that that places love as the basis of everything and inclusion as the basis of everything. And instead of there being a competitiveness or, heaven forbid, what I call scorekeeping, you're not giving as much as I did, you're not giving as much as I did. And of course, from their own perspective, each one is always insistent that they have given more than the other because they are more aware of what they have been given, of what they have given. And they are not as aware of the sacrifices because they don't recognize all the sacrifices as seen from through the eyes of the other person. So when we want to create space in our lives for what we want to include, where we want it to go, that's like someone saying, well, to use my own life again as an example, I didn't really decide, and that's why I didn't prepare for it. I didn't decide initially that I was going back to school eventually. So from the time I graduated from college until the time I went back to school was 17 years. And it was 17 years from finishing my bachelor's degree in college to beginning a master's degree at theological school. And if I had known that that was coming, of course, I would have maintained my skills in writing, and I would have practiced every day, and I would have read all sorts of different books that pertain to it and so forth. But I didn't realize until that point that I needed to get a master's degree and then plan on going into a doctoral program, and that is really where my life should have been going all along. But of course, if I had gone there 17 years earlier, that means that I would have become a college professor probably in my 30s instead of in my 50s. And that would have answered a lot of different things because there are a lot of autistics who do very well as college professors, but at the time I didn't realize that was where it was headed. And if I had done that, it also raises the question of how or whether Sister Who would have developed, the ministry of Sister Who. Because in doing so much work as Sister Who, starting actually 30 years ago, it's hard to think I've been doing anything that long, and I certainly don't feel the least bit old. I would still be happy to go out and hike another mountain if I could. Except the weather isn't cooperating and the time of year isn't cooperating at the moment. But if I had been involved in all that at the beginning, I wonder how Sister Who would have developed differently. And for that matter, the way that I got into my master's program was specifically because of what came out of being Sister Who. I had been Sister Who for 14 years at the time that I began my Master's in Theological Education, Master's in Theological Studies education. And I told them at the very beginning of that the reason I was undertaking this master's degree in theology, in theological studies, was specifically because of being Sister Who. So the theological school knew from the very beginning that I was Sister Who, in addition to being Denver Navarre. And so, with that in mind, I guess it raises the question of whether I could have even gone for a master's degree beforehand without not having the background that informed me when I went for the master's degree eventually. In becoming Sister Who and being Sister Who for 14 years, and then getting into a Master's in Theological Studies program, the dean of the chapel kind of went out on a limb and invited Sister Who to be the presenter in the weekly chapel service, and expected that I would get up behind the podium and give a lecture like everyone else. And I kind of said, well, that's not really how Sister Who works. And her eyebrows went up, and she said, oh, what did you have in mind? And I said, well, give me a couple months and I'll get back to you. And so a couple months later, I came with the first morality play that I had written based on the ideological structure of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then it was presented in chapel, and it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. In 100 years at that theological school, they had never seen anything like this. And people were so amazed at this integration of theater and spirituality that at the end of the year they gave me an award for doing it. And they were raving about it for 2 weeks after I performed it. And even the next morning, one of my professors was quoting from it in one of my classes. And all of which is wonderful, and I kind of thought, well, maybe this is what I was meant to do all along. I just didn't know it. So I wrote 2 more. But for all their enthusiasm over the first performance, the theological school wasn't quite ready to go out on a limb and have a second or a third one. So the other 2 have never been performed live yet. But the interesting thing to date is that I have now written a total of 9. And so hopefully in the next few years we'll be looking at finding ways to commit those to video and doing presentations of them through video, of these yet unperformed plays. People who have read them seem to be very impressed with the content that I put in them, and with the music that I wrote for it's basically 6 dialogues punctuated by liturgical choruses. And in both cases, I wrote the whole thing. I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back, but simply to say it didn't come from anywhere else. It came through me. And in looking back at it afterwards, I have to say, wow, did I do that? And that it's something that is inspiring to others and touches others' lives. I am honored to be the servant of the work, but in no means, and I may have actually created it, but I don't consider myself the master of it. But in all of this, trying to maintain space in my life for what I want my life to include. And within more recent developments, that means things like when I found a couple houses that nobody wanted them. And ultimately they wouldn't let me live in them because I was just too different. But when I arranged them and set them up, I was immediately thinking in terms of where am I going to put the studio, because I need to keep doing TV shows. People all over the world are asking for more TV shows. And if I had someone to help me with it so it would go much faster, there are people around the world asking for shows to be translated into other languages. And I would love to do that more than I am, but it takes far more time than most people realize, and far more effort than most people realize. And in the meantime, I'm still struggling and fighting for my own survival. But the point of all of this episode is still supposed to be making room in your life for the things that you want your life to include, and thinking of your life as a whole and not just as the present moment. I have met people who want to quote a particular theologian, fairly modern, and say it's all about focusing on the present and living in the now and not thinking of the past or the future, not dwelling on the past or the future. And I keep saying you have to have all three, because if you compare it, use the metaphor of vision, the present is what you look at. It's the focus of your vision. And the past and future are your peripheral vision. So if you can only see the present, you have glaucoma. And if you can only see the past and future, you have macular degeneration. Full vision, being able to see everything equally, means that you have both, past, present, and future, all equally, all tied together, informing you in various ways. Things come into your peripheral vision, and you respond to them in ways that you are not only dependent upon the macula or the focus. You have the peripheral vision. In the same way, I knew someone who was legally blind at one point who had macular degeneration. She had to navigate her way around the room using only her peripheral vision, never being able to see what she was actually looking at. And it was a very different way of maneuvering, but she couldn't drive, and she was legally blind, and yet she had complete macular degeneration. In not having room for what you want to include in your life, it's like macular degeneration. You may not have anyone in your life right now. You may want to in the future, but the future is in your peripheral vision. If you're not allowing space for that in your world, you're not allowing any place for your life to grow. I'm reminded of some exhibits I saw at the county fair when I was a child, of instances where people had taken a squash or a zucchini or some kind of, or pumpkin even. I don't think I saw any pumpkins though, but I think there were squash and zucchini and other sorts of vine-oriented vegetables. And when they were small and they were just beginning, they would insert the vine into the opening of a glass bottle, and then it would grow, so that by the time they were done, they couldn't take the vegetable out of the jar anymore without breaking the jar. Problem with that is if you made the jar too small, because then the vegetable would grow to the size and shape of the jar, and then it would die because it couldn't grow anymore. It was totally constrained. It would be like trying to make someone wear the clothes that they had as a child, the shoes they had as a child, to make them wear those their entire life long. And at some point, either the person would suffocate or the skin would show the negative effects of being bound, or the material itself would wear out and rip, and they wouldn't have the clothes anymore because they would literally rip off of the body. In order to have that growth, that life, that development, you have to have room to grow. And in that sense, we need to create lives that have room to grow, that have some place to put the things that we want our life to include. If we want to be moving toward a particular job or skill, or even if it's just minor little steps, doing the exercises to be sure that the muscles used for that activity are strong. If it's a particular skill, figuring out how to learn that skill in little pieces. If it's learning a foreign language, having one word in the foreign language that you memorize and learn each and every day until you have 365 words over a year's time. And recognizing that to be fluent in a language will require far more words than that. And it will also require understandings of grammar and sentences and sentence structure. And as my German teacher said in high school, you never really understand the language until you understand the people who created the language. The ways that they organize things, the ways that they connect things. In Russian, for example, there are no articles and there is no be verb. Is, are, was, were, am, being, been. All those words don't exist in Russian because the ways that they formed language didn't need them. And there are concepts in German that won't translate to English because in English they didn't feel a need for the same word, so they never created it. I was dealing with this recently with my translator of my TV shows on the Musing Note, and he had to make up a word because there wasn't one. He was trying to translate into Spanish, and he had to make up the word because in English we now have a word. We didn't before, but we now have a word called sheeple, which is a combination of sheep and people. People who don't think for themselves, people who can be herded around like sheep, and how dangerous that is, and how dehumanizing it is. And yet, when he wanted to translate that to Spanish, he discovered that Spanish didn't have a word for sheeple, and so he had to make up a word using the same sort of combination. And I don't remember what word he came up with because I don't actually know Spanish, but the amusing ways that language evolves, and in a similar way, the sometimes amusing ways that our homes evolve and our communities evolve, and trying to find ways that allow for the growth that needs to happen instead of being like the vegetable in the bottle at the county fair. That when you reach this size, you cannot grow any further without breaking the bottle. And that, if the bottle were to break, broken glass is incredibly sharp and can cause great injury and cut skin and all sorts of horrible things. And it would probably damage the vegetable in the process also. Which brings to mind the quote attributed to John F. Kennedy, a former president of the United States who was assassinated during the early 1960s, when he said that those who do not embrace peaceful revolution make violent revolution inevitable. In a similar sort of, these bottles of vegetables were exactly an illustration of that. The nutrition and the health and the nourishment of the vegetable could not be embraced without destroying the bottle. Those who do not embrace peaceful revolution, allowing the vegetable to grow in the way that it needed to, made violent revolution, breaking the vegetable out of the bottle inevitable. In the end, the person who provided that exhibit would either have to break the bottle and hope that the glass didn't get into the vegetable, or they would simply have to throw the whole thing away without any benefit whatsoever, without any nourishment, without anything to show except that they'd grown a vegetable in a bottle and thereby rendered it absolutely useless. I wonder sometimes if that is what is happening within suburban planned development communities. And I don't mean to offend anyone, but it worries me that children growing up within these carefully manicured communities have never seen a lawn that isn't mowed, have never seen a house that wasn't painted, have never seen anything the least bit unkept. And can they deal with the challenges and difficulties and inconsistencies and incongruities of life? When something doesn't quite go right, when they get a job and they can't afford a house because it costs too much, they can't afford a house in a nice community, and they have to rent an apartment above a store, or they have to live in an old house in a broken down, dilapidated kind of neighborhood where everything in the neighborhood is worn and old because the people don't have the income adequate to maintain them and don't know how to maintain them cheaply. And so you buy something that's worn out and you try to fix it up, and maybe you can and maybe you can't. I discovered in New England that I was not allowed to do so unless I was able to invest much, much more money than I had available. And because the house wasn't being done the way they wanted, but they weren't the ones going to live in it, so I don't understand the point of that. Because it wasn't done as if it were for them when it wasn't, they wouldn't allow me to live in it in a way that was appropriate to me. But the people growing up within these carefully controlled, as they say, covenant protected, but to me, covenant protected is synonymous with covenant oppressed, because it doesn't allow people to experience life as it really is. And it doesn't allow them to experience challenges and, how do you deal with this? and what happens when the lawn isn't perfect, when there are weeds in the lawn, when it isn't mowed all the time. How do you operate a mower? How do you deal with a mower that won't run because something is jammed in the wheel or the motor quit working? Who do you find? All these sorts of problem-solving challenges that simply aren't there. And I wonder if when they graduate from high school and leave their covenant-controlled communities, if these youth are then less able to deal with the challenges and problems of life, and if problem-solving is inherent to being human, if in fact they are less human by being diminished problem solvers. I was a problem solver, and only because of that experience would I know what to do if I ever had to deal with it again. But it wasn't about the rules which weren't protecting me, and it wasn't about the dishonest realtor or the dishonest attorney who cemented the deal. It wasn't about any of that. It was about being in a situation, looking around and seeing what was there and figuring out how to use it. And I don't know that I could have done that very well if I had grown up in an environment where everything was always perfect. And as I keep saying to everyone, the challenge of the current time is that this is a time when we have to rediscover each other. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this show has been helpful to you.